Welcome to History Nachos. History is more than just names and dates. It is the heritage of humanity. Here, we are all about the greatest real stories. So take a scoop and jump on in. Heroes sometimes take the most unexpected forms, like a teenage girl from a small town in a war zone. She did not have super strength or grand titles. Her power came from unshakable faith and extreme courage. She claimed to speak directly to the divine and risked a death sentence. A church investigation upheld her claims, and the girl became a sensation. At the age of 17, she demanded an audience with the leader of her country, and got it. He was so impressed that he put the young girl in command of an army and sent her on a critical mission. She led men into battle and risked her own life without hesitation. To this day, she remains an icon to her people. Welcome to episode 15, Maiden of the Sword and Cross, Joan of Arc. Sometimes you do what you think is best, whether anybody understands it or not. Dave Chappelle. That quote sums up Joan pretty well. From a very young age, she had a strong sense of purpose and pressed forward despite criticism and doubt. On multiple occasions, people thought Joan was flat out insane. But she followed her conscience and often came out ahead. Joan became famously bold in battle and in the courtroom. Under both circumstances, her life was on the line. There are definitely religious overtones in Joan's story, which I will treat as true since a lot of contemporary accounts consistently uphold them. Based on the events, I think there are three main possibilities. The first is the simplest. She really did have a prophetic experience that led her to achieve great things. Quite a few events from her life could be chalked up to divine intervention. The second is that Joan was incredibly skilled at deception and pulled off an extraordinary con to gain power she would otherwise never come close to wielding. I am actually disinclined to believe this one. Joan had plenty of chances to bail and sell out others to save her own neck, but never did. It would also require her to have that exceptional ability as early as age 13. The third provides a rather intriguing alternative. Insanity. The kind that appears normal, or even high-functioning. Joan did claim to hear voices, and displayed borderline reckless aggression in battle. However, under this scenario, Joan would need almost perfect circumstances, and lottery-winning luck, on multiple occasions. Believing in that level of coincidence requires a similar amount of faith as the prophetic experience explanation. Throughout this episode, I encourage you to draw your own conclusions. Before going any further, please remember to comment, like, and share. Also, stick around at the end for bonus content. In order to even begin understanding Joan, we need to look at the world she grew up in. As the Dark Ages came to an end, two new powers emerged in Western Europe, England and France. Their rivalry traces back to the ancient Germanic tribes. As England and France became more and more powerful, they constantly fought over land, power, and wealth. Generation after generation killed each other for centuries. By the early 1400s, an uneasy truce existed, but the once great French king had become fully insane. France's top echelon started angling for the crown. The resulting succession crisis caused a full-blown civil war. England saw an opportunity to invade and swept across northern France. Peace was achieved, when the French agreed to disinherit the crown prince and make the English king's children the new heirs to the French throne. The whole thing fell apart when the French and English kings died simultaneously, leaving the French throne to an infant. France split into 3 parts: England in the north, the Civil War rebels in the east, and the former crown prince held the rest. Very soon, the fight was back on. Joan was born and raised in northeastern France, right in the middle of the fighting. Most of her childhood was spent in a war zone. Joan grew up in Domremy, a small town in a contested area. That part of eastern France is no stranger to the rage of war. It has been a frequent conflict zone since prehistory. During World War I, that area near Verdun would become one of the most deadly parts of the Western Front. Joan's father was a successful farmer who played a part in protecting the town whenever things got too dangerous. Joan's early life was similar to a normal country girl, but punctuated by periodic open warfare. To me, it sounds a lot like life in the mountains of modern Afghanistan. We actually have a pretty good idea about Joan's personality as a child due to multiple first-hand accounts from people who personally knew her. She was a solid and respected member of the community, classic sweet farmer's daughter. Joan was also highly devout in her religious faith, even by standards of medieval Europe. At age 13, Joan began having prophetic visions. Her first one was truly spectacular. According to Joan, here is what happened. A voice and a light came from her right. It seemed to be a worthy voice, sent by God. After she heard the voice a third time, she knew it was an angel. It told her to be good and keep going to church regularly. Then she saw. This was no ordinary angel. Standing before her was Michael the Archangel, God's top general, accompanied by a host of angels. He gave Joan a mission: leave for the Crown Prince's territory and lift the siege of Orléans. The garrison commander in Vaucouleurs would arrange her journey. Joan simply replied that she had no idea how to even ride a horse, let alone lead an army. The Archangel promised he would send 2 saints to guide Joan. She needed to follow their advice. It was by God's order. Whether real or an illusion, that is one powerful experience. Either way, it left quite an impression on Joan. Also, it was not an isolated incident. Joan claimed that for the next several years, she would have prophetic visions with the saints multiple times a week. How to interpret that is up to you. At age 17, Joan finally decided to go through with her mission. But she faced a few problems. First and foremost, this was 1428, and Joan was a teenage girl in a medieval European war zone. Not exactly easy or safe to travel alone. Second, she had to sneak through over 200 miles of enemy territory. Even if Joan made it through that gauntlet, she was still a peasant girl trying to get FaceTime with the head honcho. Joan figured if she could just get to nearby Vaucouleurs, God would cover the journey from there. After all, that is what the vision promised. Joan ended up convincing her uncle to escort her and make it look like they were visiting family. It turns out Vaucouleurs was one of the last fortified cities in the area, holding out loyalty to the crown prince. Once Joan got to Vaucouleurs, she needed to find the garrison commander, even though she had never met the guy. Well, the voice in Joan's head pointed him out. Joan being Joan, she just walked up to this dude and told him the deal. The commander thought she was nuts. He blew Joan off. But she kept coming back. The commander eventually lost his cool and told off Joan's uncle, recommending Joan be taken home and slapped. Before you judge the guy too harshly, that probably was the closest thing medieval Europe had to treating insanity. Joan finally got the hint and headed home. Shortly after Joan's first shot at the mission, the English made huge advances. Joan's entire hometown had to evacuate, and Vaucouleurs came under attack. The commander had to sign a peace deal that took him out of the war. Then the English began readying for another big push. A decisive battle was bound to occur soon. The English set their sights on a highly strategic location, the city of Orléans. Capturing Orléans would put the English in position to win the entire war and completely take over France. In the summer of 1428, the English laid siege to Orléans. It was still going when winter arrived, so in early 1429, Joan decided to give her mission another try. When Joan came to Vaucouleurs again, one of the soldiers recognized Joan and decided to help her. Given the dangerous nature of a young woman traveling through enemy-occupied territory, Joan decided to go in disguise. The soldier volunteered to be one of Joan's guards and hooked her up with male clothing. Cross-dressing was a serious crime, but a well-known exception existed for safety necessities like travel disguises. Now Joan just needed the commander to give her a proper escort squad. When Joan approached him, the commander probably thought, "Oh no, not this again." Just like last time, Joan kept bugging the commander. On Joan's third try, she convinced the commander she was not crazy by telling him the result of a faraway battle before word reached Vaucouleurs. The commander's jaw hit the floor when the incoming news matched Joan's prediction. He gave Joan everything she needed for the journey, and a letter of recommendation. Joan and her guards set out on an 11-day stealth mission behind enemy lines. As word about Joan spread, it became risky to appear in public. Joan still insisted on going to mass in churches along the way. Against the odds, Joan made it to the Crown Prince's territory without incident. Upon arrival to friendly lands, Joan went to 3 church services in one day. Makes sense after such a nerve-wracking couple of weeks. Joan also wrote letters ahead to the Crown Prince telling him she was on the way with a mission from God. To prove herself, Joan claimed she would be able to pick the Crown Prince out of a crowd of nobles. The letters went to the Crown Prince's ministers first, since he did not have time to read all the mail. They were split on whether Joan was the real deal. However, Joan promised to lift the siege of Orléans and retake Reims if given an army. Reims was the official place to crown French kings, and the enemy controlled it. Retaking Reims would allow the prince to officially be crowned king of France, which would remove England's justification for the war. Between the strategic importance of Orléans and the political importance of Reims, Joan presented a potentially game-changing opportunity. Even with their divided opinions, the ministers decided to at least have the Crown Prince hear Joan out. The Crown Prince was open to possibilities, but skeptical, so he had priests interview Joan. Much like the ministers, the priests had split opinions, but decided enough looked legit to have Joan appear before the Crown Prince. Upon Joan's arrival to the royal court, she faced one final test. A crowd of nobles had turned out to see the girl claiming to be on a mission directly from God. The Crown Prince hid in the crowd to see if Joan really could pick him out like she claimed. Just like with the Vaucouleurs commander, the voice in Joan's head pointed out the Crown Prince and she walked right up to him. Everybody was stunned, including the Crown Prince himself. He immediately brought Joan into the back chambers so they could speak in private. Joan took the full contents of that conversation to her grave, but the Crown Prince announced Joan had told him a great secret that nobody could possibly know. Several sources believe Joan told the Crown Prince one of his private prayers verbatim. Whatever happened, it convinced the Crown Prince that Joan was for real. Just to be certain, over the next several weeks, the Crown Prince had high-level clergy seriously examine Joan. It was basically the religious version of a federal background check. The Crown Prince was impressed with Joan, but he wanted to be sure before giving a high military command to a teenage peasant girl. In the process, Joan took weeks of serious grilling from some of France's top intellectuals. The idea of people doubting Joan's faith really ticked her off. During the questioning, Joan showed her young age a bit when some of the teenage angst came out. She started getting impatient and asking for troops to take to Orléans already. Joan was so sure she would be cleared that she sent a harshly worded surrender or die letter to the English king and his generals. Several original copies still survive today. Ultimately, Joan passed the background check with flying colors. Now the Crown Prince was dead sure that Joan was the real deal. She was sent to the staging ground for the counterattack on Orléans. There, Joan got decked out with custom banners and armor. We are talking top-of-the-line plate armor specifically tailored to Joan's body. Joan also asked for a specific sword that had belonged to St. Catherine, one of the saints that supposedly guided her. The sword was a lost relic, but Joan gave pinpoint directions on where to find it under the floor of a particular church. Surprisingly enough, the sword was right where Joan said it would be. The priest handed it right over. Joan was now in command of a serious amount of troops heading to Orléans. She received a type of authority called titular command. Remember, this was back when command positions had both military and political functions. Titular command made a political figure technically in charge, but the tactics were often left to a team of veteran subcommanders. Joan was nowhere near the first woman or religious visionary to be given a titular command. However, the fact that Joan was only 17 and not in the nobility was truly exceptional. She was also not content just to act as a figurehead. From the get-go, Joan wanted to take charge and aggressively bring the fight to the English, which earned her a degree of respect from her officers. However, when Joan took command, she walked into a whole different world. These guys were medieval French soldiers. Like many soldiers across history, they engaged in all kinds of vices and debauchery when not in battle. Prostitutes and mistresses were given the nickname camp followers because they were around so much. For a devout farmer's daughter, it was quite a culture shock. The whole situation made Joan flip the table angry. Joan immediately cracked down hard on all the funny business. No more debauchery, looting, or swearing. Everyone also had to regularly attend Mass and go to confession. It was a large adjustment, but Joan's men complied. Joan's greatest rage was directed at the camp followers. Joan took her chastity very seriously, and was flabbergasted by the floozies. However, Joan offered a compromise. Only women married to soldiers could come into camp. That meant soldiers had to marry their girlfriends, or favorite camp followers, if they wanted to have women around. Breaking this rule carried serious consequences. On a later occasion, Joan even drew her sword and angrily chased a prostitute out of the camp. Now that Joan had laid down the law and established her authority, her army got underway to Orléans. They marched up to Orléans by following the Loire River on the French-controlled side, which was opposite of Orléans. Once near Orléans, they found it impossible to ferry the whole army across the river. This meant everyone had to backtrack for days to get back to a safe crossing point. Even so, the leader of Orléans still wanted Joan to come into the city and make a public appearance to bring hope to the besieged people. Joan initially refused and wanted to stay with her troops, but ultimately relented. She took a small part of the army and told everyone else to go back to the starting point, cross the river behind French lines, and come back to Orléans through enemy territory. Not ideal, but it was the only realistic option. Then Joan snuck into Orléans after dark. Even though trying to maintain secrecy, word got out in Orléans that Joan was coming. People turned out in droves, and Joan entered the city to a hero's welcome. During her stay in Orléans, Joan would constantly be followed by adoring crowds. Her very presence completely changed the city's morale. While Joan's army doubled back, She started getting the lay of the land. The English had built a series of heavily fortified strongholds surrounding Orléans. Joan tried to negotiate a peace deal through messengers, but the English did not take her seriously. One point in the defenses had a gap narrow enough to shout across. When Joan tried to speak directly to the English, it basically became the taunting scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The insults were much more vulgar than "your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries." Then Joan's army arrived, and a commander went rogue by launching an attack on the English without telling Joan. The family hosting Joan had to wake her up and tell her what was going on. Joan sprang up, put on her armor, and rode out of the city gate at full speed to join her troops. Much like a modern teenager needing to rush out the door after sleeping through their alarm. Upon seeing Joan, her guys rallied and took an English fort. The English defenses started folding, and they had to pull back. When Joan's guys took the English fort, they killed almost everyone. Joan ordered that the English priests be spared, and treated them well. Even though Joan believed she fought for a righteous cause, she hated killing. After the day's fighting, she broke down crying for the English dead. Just to be clear, Joan did not believe killing the English was wrong. But she was still a compassionate person, saddened by the loss of life. The battle had now begun in earnest. Joan's sub-commanders planned a bunch of fancy tactics and diversions, but Joan just looked at them like they were crazy and overrode the decision. She basically told them, "The English are right there. How about we just charge in and kill them?" Over the next several days, Joan proved an exceptionally bold commander. Her belief in divine providence played a large part. Under Joan's leadership, the French pushed hard and took some of the most strategic English forts, despite overwhelming odds. In the process, an arrow hit Joan between her shoulder and neck. The army was heartbroken at the thought of losing Joan, and the attack began to falter. Joan got patched up, pushed through the pain, and was back in the field within a few hours to bring the attack in. Naturally, Joan could not just hang back, so she prominently led from the front. The tide turned, and the French won the day. The French quickly established a wide gap in the English lines and broke the siege. The English withdrew, and Orléans was free. Mission accomplished. The people of Orléans were ecstatic after the siege was lifted. The whole city celebrated non-stop for 2 days. Every year, Orléans still celebrates Joan on the anniversary of the victory. Liberating Orléans is still considered the critical turning point in the 100 Years' War. A French duke who later joined with Joan toured the leftover English forts at Orléans and was astounded that Joan could take them. He chalked it up to divine intervention without a doubt in his mind, as did many of Joan's troops. The top English commander from Orléans would later attribute the French victory to Joan. Among the English, Joan became feared more than any other French commander. In the weeks following Orléans, Joan would deliver more victories. Her mere presence on a battlefield would completely change the mood on both sides. Joan became an A-list celebrity all over France. The French were on a roll, scoring win after win, and had the English on the run. Now a great opportunity presented itself. The path to Reims became open. The crown prince could finally have a formal coronation at the traditional place. Then his claim to the throne would be undisputable. Joan urged for the crown prince to go to Reims for a coronation, but politics got in the way, and the crown prince would start and stop several times. He ultimately decided to go for it. When the French arrived, the enemy forces in Reims were far outmatched, so they bugged out. The crown prince soon became a crowned king. Joan was right next to him in a place of honor during the ceremony. After the king was crowned, Joan dropped to her knees, grabbed the king's legs, and cried tears of joy. She declared, "Noble king, now is accomplished the will of God, who wished me to lift the siege of Orleans, and to bring you to this city of Reims to receive your holy anointing, to show that you are the true king, and the one for whom the kingdom of France should belong." There was not a dry eye in the room. Joan's prophetic vision had come true. Everything she had worked so hard for was now realized. It was probably one of the best days of her life. The newly crowned king went on a tour to rally loyalty. Those siding with the English could no longer stay allies based on ruler legitimacy. Quite a few areas came back under French control voluntarily. The succession issue behind the entire war was closed for debate, so the king started negotiating for peace with the English. The French negotiated terribly and made all kinds of concessions even though they had the upper hand. A 4-month truce was declared. At this point, Joan went rogue and marched on Paris. As always, she led from the front. During the first assault, Joan was hit by a crossbow bolt, and her troops had to drag her kicking and screaming away from the battlefield. Joan's second-in-command set up another attack, but word came from the top to cease and desist. The whole mess completely undermined the army's morale. Not the first time faraway politicians have made a bad call that influenced a battle. For the next several months, Joan faced a mix of victory and defeat. During the winter, everything relatively calmed down due to the truce and the weather, but the English used the truce to recover and regroup. When spring came, the fighting resumed. Now I should mention, France was not just fighting the English. They also fought Burgundians, the rebels in eastern France. Throughout this whole thing, the Burgundians have allied with England. Keep that in mind going forward. After the war picked back up, Joan had a disturbing vision. The guiding saints told Joan she would soon be captured by the enemy. Her greatest fears were betrayal and capture. Less than 3 weeks later, Joan acted strangely nervous during her morning prayers. She even declared, "Pray for me, for I have been betrayed." That day, Joan was caught in an ambush. Joan was among the last to retreat. While most of her troops were able to flee into a walled city, the drawbridge was raised before Joan made it. There are several conspiracy theories on whether Joan was betrayed. Some believe the English paid off someone to shut Joan out. Others think it was an inside job by conniving politicians. The drawbridge also may have been raised because the enemy got too close. Whatever went down, Joan was cornered and captured by Burgundians. The French tried everything in their power to free Joan, but the Burgundians refused to trade Joan for anything. She was too valuable. Within a few months, she was sold to the English for a large sum. Now Joan was in enemy hands for the long run. She was a prisoner of war, a beautiful young woman, and a symbol of hope for France. Any terrible thing was possible. The English wanted Joan dead, but could not outright torture and kill her. That would make Joan a martyr and source of inspiration for the French. They came up with a more creative solution. Have the Catholic Church declare Joan a heretic, which meant a death sentence. The idea was to discredit Joan on religious grounds before killing her. The English officially accused Joan of heresy and set up a trial overseen by priests. They only chose priests sympathetic to the English and used bribery to guarantee the result. Normally, when a woman was accused of heresy, she would be held in a church-run jail and guarded by nuns. The English arranged for Joan to be thrown into a military prison guarded by soldiers. I think it is pretty clear what the English intended to happen, especially since Joan was famous for her chastity. The guards tried to force themselves on Joan several times, but never succeeded. Joan had kept her soldier clothing and firmly tied everything in place with a bunch of laces. The trial began as a public affair, but Joan bested all the arguments against her. We still have the court transcript. Even a rigged trial breaking a ton of legal rules could not make anything stick. After that embarrassment, the trial was held behind closed doors. The court ultimately had to entrap Joan with a technicality. The clothes Joan wore to protect herself in prison were men's clothing. Remember, wearing men's clothing was often permitted in such circumstances. The court got around that by having Joan consent to wearing a dress. Well, the guards came after her again, and Joan had to fight them off. Then Joan's dress was taken away, and she was given the forbidden men's clothes. When Joan put them on, boom, heretic crossdresser. The court sentenced Joan to be burned at the stake. When the day came, Joan calmly heard a sermon. She then addressed the English crowd. Instead of railing against them, Joan forgave the English in a moving speech. By the end, even soldiers, high officials, and the priests who sentenced Joan were openly weeping. As Joan was tied to the stake, she made one final request: a cross. A friar brought one from a nearby church and held it in front of Joan until the flames rose. On May 30th, 1431, Joan shouted praise to Jesus and the saints until she died of smoke inhalation. She was only 19 years old. After the execution, the English king's personal representative exclaimed, "We are all ruined, for a good and holy person was burned." Perhaps he was right. From this point on, England was mostly on the retreat. By the end of the 100 Years' War, the English would lose almost all their land in France. To this day, Joan remains an iconic hero to the French people. Nobody can take away her victories and lasting cultural impact. 5 centuries after her death, Joan's name still widely inspired bravery on the battlefields of World War I. In 1920, the Catholic Church officially declared her a saint. And not just any saint, the patron saint of France. I think Joan would like that. You have officially made it to the bonus material, the guacamole on these history nachos. Stick around to hear about the aftermath, modern relevance, or anything else we decide to throw in. Almost 20 years later, the French retook the city where Joan was burned. They immediately initiated an appeal of Joan's sentence to clear her name. The conviction was ruled illegal, the court deemed corrupt, and the whole process declared an act of heresy. Joan was officially found innocent and considered wrongfully executed. The second trial did things more by the book, but admittedly had the goal of rehabilitating Joan's reputation. Many witnesses who personally knew Joan gave testimony. We still have the court record. Most of the witnesses believed Joan was, in fact, the real deal. Like I said at the beginning, draw your own conclusions. For those of you that want more details, the biography of Joan of Arc by Alan Williamson is excellent. It is heavily footnoted with direct quotes from primary sources. You can read Joan's own account of her life from the first trial transcript. The second trial's record provides stories from her family, friends, and allies. As always, we would love to hear your feedback. Our contact information and social media sites are in the description. Older episodes are all freely available on YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider making a donation on Patreon or PayPal. It is the digital version of putting change in a singer's tip jar. Any amount is greatly appreciated. Until next time, thanks for listening.